We are 16, excuse me. We just finished chapter 15. And chapter 15 is strong. Krishna explains that he is the maker of the Vedas, Vedanta Krit. He explains that he knows the Vedas, Vedavit. He explains that the Vedas are all about him. Vedescha sarvarahame Vedya. He explained that he's in everyone's heart. Hridi sanivishta. And from him, mata, comes memory, knowledge, and forgetfulness. Smriti or jnanam and apohana. And then he explains the essence of the Vedas, that there's two kinds of people that exist. Dvavimau purusha loke, and there's some people are fallen into materialism, and some people are liberated. Kshara and akshara. And everybody, more or less, is in a bewildered state of existence. Kshara sarvani bhutani, but that some people have reached the pinnacle of self-realization. Kutastha akshara uchate. Then he explains that even though some people reach, a level of self-realization, the supreme being is different. Ushama purusha tu anya. Which of course means that you don't become God at some stage of self-realization. This is perhaps the cleanest place in the Gita where the fundamental distinction between the soul and God is fully articulated. And I say fully articulated because there's this little ray of hope for someone who wants to see you can become God. That whenever a distinction is made between the soul and God, they can say, well, that's at the stage of, being bound in this world. But when you achieve self-realization, then you become one with God. And so the way to figure out what somebody actually believes is you ask them, what happens at the zenith of self-realization in your tradition or according to you? When you achieve absolute perfection, at that moment of salvation or satori or nirvana or mukti or whatever, liberation, whatever you want to call it, at that moment, does the distinction between the soul and God continue? Is it concrete? Is it fundamental? Is it innate? Is it ontologically basic? Or does that distinction melt away and it was just a transitory distinction between you and God, and it was a transitory difference between you and the universe, but that's all part of the grand illusion that upon achieving a full stage of self-realization, do you then become one with the deity? You have to ask people their end game. That's the only way. Otherwise, if they say there's a difference, they could mean there's a difference in this world right now, but there's not a difference in eternity. Did you follow this, Brooke? Yeah? Okay. So it's tough to nail somebody's ontology down, their basic fundamental worldview vis-a-vis God. It's tough to nail it down. You have to ask very precise questions. Otherwise, somebody could sound real devout, but if their ultimate conception is eventually they'll achieve self-realization and then they'll become one with the deity, then they are actually an impersonalist. So there is no place in the Gita more clearly than this section where Krishna shuts the door on such a conception. Because he says that the Supreme Being is different than both the liberated and the conditioned soul. Paramatma iti udahrita, therefore he's known as Paramatma, the Supreme Soul. Yo lokachayama vishya, he's entered into these three worlds. Bibharti, he's maintaining them. Avyam Ishram, he's always been the Lord. So he doesn't become the Lord, he's always been the Lord. And he's maintaining these worlds. And so these are some of the things that distinguish God from the individual soul. And then he says, Yasmakshara atitoham, because I'm beyond the fallen soul. Aksharad apichotama, because I'm also beyond the liberated soul. And I'm supreme. Then Loke Vede Cha, in the Vedas and also in this world, Pratita Purushottama, I'm known as Purushottam. Ato asmi Loke Vede Cha Pratita Purushottama. Therefore I am known in this world and in the scriptures as the supreme being, Purushottam, supreme being. And then Krishna says, if you know me like this, Janati Purushottamam, if you know me as the supreme being, without any doubts, asamudha, then you know everything, sasarvavit, and then you worship me, bhajatimam, with all your heart, sarva bhavena. And he says, this is the greatest secret of all shastras, iti guhyatamam shastram. So this is the greatest secret, therefore there's nothing higher than this. This is about the fundamental nature of the self in both its realized as well as its conditioned state. And I am the supreme being. If you know me like that, the result of that is you know everything. In other words, there's nothing that remains to be known. There is no higher level of realization. This is the highest understanding of Scripture. Tama, it means greatest in Sanskrit, but it's also, guhya means secret. It's the greatest secret of all Shastra. But you could just as easily understand it as the most advanced. Tama is the superlative. Tara is the comparative, good, better, best. Better is the comparative, best is the superlative, means the absolute best of something, the greatest of something. That's reflected by the Sanskrit suffix tama. And then guhya from gu means secret, hidden, but it also means advanced, because if you have an advanced degree in particle physics or an advanced degree in chemistry, it means that you are in possession of knowledge which most people don't have. So secret really also translates quite well as advanced. This is the most advanced understanding of Shastra. And you know everything if you know this. And the result is you become a devotee. Bhajatimam sarva bhavana. You worship me with all your heart. Bhaj is where you get the word bhakti from. The suffix kati added to the Sanskrit root bhaj, bhakti. And then sarva bhavana means with all your heart, to further emphasize that it's bhakti. And so this indicates that the distinction between the soul and God is fundamental because it's true in the liberated as well as the conditioned state. The Lord is different than us because he maintains the world and has always been the Lord. And then it repeats itself, because I am beyond both the conditioned and the unconditioned soul. I'm known as Purushottam, which means the supreme being, which indicates an individual personality, an individual God, a fundamentally personal source of all existence. And if you know that, you know everything. It's the greatest secret, the highest, most advanced knowledge of all Shastra, and the result is you become a devotee. So in a lot of ways, this end of the 15th chapter, it really finishes with a bang. Theologically speaking, it finishes with some pomp and circumstance, with a big bang. And the 16th chapter follows on the coattails of that. And usually there is some kind of a connection between the various chapters of the Gita. And I think the lead-in to the 16th chapter is the 15th chapter has spoken so strongly about what Krishna's been speaking about the whole time in the Gita, which is that you should be a devotee and why you should be a devotee and the fundamental features of reality that should lead an intelligent person to become a devotee, because this is the nature of reality and therefore in response to it you should become a devotee. And then Krishna is going to contrast that and tell you what your other option is. And so the 16th chapter of the Gita it's really the only chapter of the Gita that doesn't directly contain verses about bhakti. There's some indirect verses about bhakti, which we'll get to. But the 16th chapter of the Gita is really the only chapter of the Gita that doesn't contain any actual bhakti. for sure, every other chapter, with the possible exception of the 17th, directly talks about bhakti. And the 17th has some really cool bhakti-type stuff in it. Enough that, I'm going to give the 17th credit for having bhakti in it. The 16th chapter is really the only chapter that doesn't directly speak about bhakti. It's unique in that sense. And that'll become clear really soon why. Because the whole 16th chapter is a contrast to what Krishna has been teaching us all along. So, without further ado, let's dig in. It's a relatively short chapter. I think it's got maybe 24 verses or something like that. So, the first 3 verses are done together. Fearlessness, purification of one's existence, cultivation of spiritual knowledge, charity, self-control, performance of sacrifice, say the Vedas, austerity, simplicity, non-violence, truthfulness, freedom from anger, renunciation, tranquility, aversion to fault-finding, compassion for all living entities, freedom from covetousness, gentleness, modesty, stay determination, vigor, forgiveness, fortitude, cleanliness, and freedom from envy and from the passion for honor. These transcendental qualities, O son of Bharat, belong to godly men endowed with divine nature. There you go. Doesn't actually say men. And I think when Prabhupada's speaking here of men, I think he means mankind. If you look at feminist literature from before they got into gender-neutral language in in like a serious way in the feminist movement in the 70s and mid-70s, although there's been, attempts to come up with gender-neutral language previously, it really got a kick in the pants in the mid-70s. There's a couple of authors who put out some gender-neutral language books. I think the first one was called Gender-Neutral Language. Very, very popular books. And they changed the nature of copywriting and what was considered to be appropriate. And nowadays, generally it's favored to use gender-neutral language whenever possible. But if you look even at feminist literature from prior to the mid-70s, you'll find that they regularly spoke of, the calling of man and the responsibility of man in a collective sense to mean mankind. Anyway, the word man isn't even here, but it says belong to godly men endowed with divine nature. It sounds a little Christian. Sura and asura, they get rendered variously. Sura sometimes gets translated as devotee or godly people, and then asura is the opposite of sura, and it means atheists or materialists. Sometimes it gets rendered as demons. The problem with the term, rendering the term asura as demon, is it indicates a demon is a fixed malefic entity based on a dualistic conception of evil, that there's a fundamental evil, and demons are created of that evil, and therefore they're fundamentally at fault with no hope for redemption. And so the problem with using fun terms like demonic, which it's great to use that kind of just really over the top language, especially like as a self-righteous priest or something like that. Back demons, it's like it's there's a certain sort of seductive appeal. It's so definitive and whatever. But the problem with using terms like that is, in English, those terms indicate a fundamentally malefic entity, and that's just not how the terms get used in Sanskrit. So the terms being rendered into English here, Sura and Asura, Daivi and Asura. Daivi is where you get the word divine from div. I think the chapter is called Daivi Asura guna vibhag yoga, the distinction, Daivi asura sampad yoga, the qualities of Daiva, divine qualities, and asura, so basically, materialistic qualities. If the one is divine, then I guess you could say demonic would be the opposite of divine. But the problem with demonic is it indicates there's like a straight hell where people go forever, and there's God and the devil, and they are fundamentally basic beings. And so that doesn't work with the Indic worldview. So probably a better rendering, if you want to get real technical, would be divine and materialistic qualities. Anyway, these terms are Vedic. They show up in old Sanskrit literature. Sura and Asura. So they're used in various ways. I mean, sometimes the Aryan people are considered to be Daivi and Asuras, and then the non-Aryan people that are being conquered by the Aryan people on horseback in the old Veda, in the wars that took place in the old Veda, they're called the Asuras. In which case, they're certainly not devils or demons. They're just the people who were being invaded by the Aryans. That whole Aryan brotherhood and like Hitler's thing with the Aryans, that's from the Sanskrit Vedas. Arya means cultured. So there's the Aryans versus the Dasyus versus the people they were fighting against. Sometimes they're called Asuras and the Aryans are called Suras. So the term goes all the way back to that time. Okay, so although I said we're going to be, the chapter is really a contrast, that certainly didn't sound like a contrast. But then we've got pride, arrogance, conceit, anger, harshness, and ignorance. These qualities belong to those of demoniac nature. There's the Asura Bhava. Asurim Sampada. These are the qualities or the qualifications or the glories of the Asuras. These people who are, they're Abhijatasya Asurim Sampadam. The people who are born towards a materialistic nature. Anyway, the transcendental qualities, the Daivi Sampad, the qualities which are Divya, which are Daiva, which are divine, they're conducive to liberation. And then the demoniac qualities are made for bondage. The Nibandha, they bind you down to this world, therefore materialism. You follow? As opposed to down to hell or something like that. Although that does get a little nod in this chapter too. You'll see it in a second. Mashusha, don't worry. You are born with divine qualities. So Arjuna is being encouraged. That although he spoke, and Krishna is speaking about good qualities and bad qualities, Daivi Sampad and Asura Sampad, good and bad qualities, that Arjuna has the good qualities. In this world there are two kinds of created beings. One is called divine, the other is demoniac. There's the Daiva and Asura. I've already explained to you at length of the divine qualities. Now hear from me of the demoniac. So Krishna is now saying, I'm going to talk elaborately about the bad things, the Asura Sampad. Again, I think that a better way to translate this, if you want to really convey the meaning, would be to say spiritual and material, or uplifting and degrading, or divine would perhaps be a really clean translation into English of Daiva, and then materialistic as the counter for divine. And materialistic is certainly a good counter for the word divine. Of course, the real thing is even these divine qualities by themselves, without devotion to God, aren't really divine. So then there's now you get into, somebody could be humble and not believe in God. They could be renounced and not believe in God. They could be nonviolent. Ahimsa is one of the good qualities, and not believe in God. So these qualities aren't necessarily linked to one's spirituality. So even divine and materialistic isn't a perfect translation either. Maybe uplifting and degrading would perhaps be the cleanest way to communicate philosophically what's being expressed. They're uplifting qualities that should be cultivated by someone who's interested in progress, and then there's degrading qualities which knock you down. They bind you to this world. So they're materialistic, but they're also degrading. They're impious. Because you could be materialistic, but piously materialistic. You can be really attached to your family, be really good and pious, not do anything innately sinful, but just be a materialistic person. So I think uplifting and degrading is good. But then it says that the one qualities are good for liberation. Vimokshaya, for vimukti. So they're kind of spiritual. They're definitely uplifting. They're pious. They're cultured. And they're more connected directly to divinity. The other qualities, in contrast, are degrading, materialistic. They're binding. They take away your freedom. And they are fundamentally atheistic. And so, a plethora of terms being used to define these one word and how it's being used throughout the chapter, I think is a better way to go if you really want to get what's going on and escape the angels and demons, or something like that. However, if I was going to defend Prabhupada's translation, divine and demoniac, if I was going to defend that translation and explain why it's superior to mine, well, my translation has taken me paragraphs and minutes to explain, which you don't have when you're doing verse translations in a book. And so, you got to pick a word. You can't say what I just said. You can leave the word untranslated. That's, I think I'd actually prefer to do that. It just makes life a lot easier. It demands of the reader that they get a glossary of terms that they learn, but it spares you from having to give paragraphs of definitions for terms. But Prabhupada, didn't go that way. He didn't leave the terms untranslated, which, like I said, I prefer. But he wasn't talking to people who were going to go and get a glossary of terms, had a lot of access to Google and things like that. There was a time where if you wanted to figure something out, you had to go to the library. And then the library would only have certain books. It wasn't like you got access to everything which was out there in terms of the literature. You got access to some books. Sometimes I go to different libraries to study the same subject because different libraries had different books. I used to call libraries sometimes to figure out what books they had. If I wanted to get a particular book to look up a subject, there was no internet. Books weren't online. You couldn't get books online. You had to get books from either a bookstore or go to a library. Everybody had a library card. I had library cards at multiple libraries. I would go to the library and study. Most of you don't remember this. Because, by the 2000s, by the early aughts, this whole thing had changed around. Even by the late 90s, definitely by the early aughts. But I was going to school in the 80s. And it was a whole different universe. You get microfiche. Like, look up old newspaper articles on microfiche. It's like reels of, like really small slides on this like reels of cellophane. You put them into a little computer and it blows them up, and you can store a lot of information on a small thing. You look through microfiche. And like look up newspaper articles and like scroll through tons of stuff to look for what you wanted. It's crazy. Most homes had an encyclopedia, including mine, which was, just like a super primitive wiki. But with like maybe 1/100th of the subjects, and with probably, I don't know, a quarter of the rigor. But you had to have a book where you could look stuff up. So, everybody had dictionaries, like actual physical books, like dictionaries. We'd open them up. They had little thumb things where you, for the A, B, C, D, and so you could see them, and so you could just quickly find the right letter, and then you look up words. So, if you're going to translate and people don't have access to just Google the term, you could do like an extensive glossary at the end of the book, which we do. We have a glossary at the end of our books, but that's how many words you can put in your glossary. I would say put asura and daiva. Of course, I understand the word demoniac in a different way than Prabhupada did. Prabhupada wasn't raised with this radical dualism of Christianity. He was familiar with it. Prabhupada went to a Christian school, so he was familiar to some extent with Christianity and Christian theology. But he never displayed this like incredible, deep command of Christianity. Like he really studied it in extreme depth. He also, I don't think Prabhupada was a car mechanic, so I don't consider either one of those things to be a major flaw in his character. And so I think Prabhupada probably used the term demon like with a little d. In contrast, he would use the term nonsense in a very heavy way, like with a capital N. If Prabhupada called you a nonsense, he meant you're insane. Like there's something wrong with you. You're a crazy person. You're schizophrenic. Something like that. Whereas we're like, you're a nonsense. It's like it's hard to even say with a straight face. It's like calling somebody a blockhead. It just doesn't have the bite of calling somebody an idiot or a fool or something like that. And so Prabhupada had his usage of English. He chose the term divine and demoniac. Divine's pretty clean because it's etymologically linked, but I don't think philosophically it quite nails it, because a lot of the qualities without devotion to God would be possible, in which case they would no longer be truly divine qualities. They would be pious, materialistic qualities, and Krishna certainly it makes a distinction between pious materialism and actual transcendence. So to defend Prabhupada's translation, we could point to Prabhupada's ignorance of Christian theology and the radical dualism of Middle Eastern theology, but I don't think we have to go there. We could also just go with the idea that he had to pick two terms, and what Krishna's really doing here is he's dividing things up into two neat categories. And so you got to pick real polarized terms, real contrasting light and dark terms. You don't really want a lot of room for gray, because the very nature of what Krishna's trying to do is give you a real easy heuristic of like it's either this or that. And so Prabhupada picked some terms that packed a wallop. And then you're left to people like me to explain them. If you go through the purports for the chapter and you actually read the whole chapter, you get a sense of what's going on. But he picked a couple of terms that really, really hit you with the dualism that this chapter has. And he says, these one quality is binding to this world, the other qualities are good for liberation. There's two kinds of beings. One is called divine, the other demoniac. I've already explained to you at length the divine qualities. Now hear from me the demoniac. Okay, there's two kinds of created beings, divine, demoniac. Which one are you? Are you proud? That's a demoniac quality. Are you harsh? Krura. I don't think krura is used here. I think it's used later on in the chapter. But you take a look. It's like one of them is anger. The other one is not anger. One of them is mild. The other one is harsh. So which one are you? Are you mild or harsh? Are you humble or proud? Are you violent or non-violent? That might be easier for most people. Are you lusty or renounced? Are you greedy or free from greed? Which if we're going to make it, they do this, like if you do with the Myers-Briggs, they ask you questions. You might not even want to answer, but they only let you pick one thing. It's like between this and this, what do you pick? They don't really, if you're like, well, I like half of that one and half of this one, they don't do that for you. They give you what are called double-barrel questions, like a double-barrel shotgun, where you blast somebody with both barrels. I don't know if you guys understand shotguns, but some old shotguns, they weren't pump-action shotguns. That's a later thing. you'd have a single or a double-barreled shotgun. So a shotgun would either hold 1 or 2 bullets. It had 2 triggers. A double-barreled shotgun had 2 triggers. You could pull both triggers simultaneously, and then you shoot somebody with 2 barrels. You have to reload. You could also pull 1 trigger, and you shoot them with 1 barrel, and you have another bullet. So like basically a 2-bullet gun. So a double-barrel question in surveys is a question which has 2 things instead of 1. Do you like teachers who ask you questions and give snacks at the end of the lesson? Or do you like teachers that, that don't ask questions and don't give you snacks? You follow? What if you like the snacks and the question, or you don't like the question, but you do like snacks, or vice versa? Sometimes they force you with a double barrel question. It's actually bad when you're doing a survey. Personality indices, they do this all the time. The personality inventory tests, they'll ask you double, triple barrel questions, and you just have to pick one of the answers over the other. So if you were forced to pick, which one is it? Are you proud or humble, lusty and greedy, or I don't know what the opposite is, not greedy and not lusty? Which one is it? See the problem? So most of us are going to fit into both categories. We're going to be somewhere in between. So Krishna's statement, there's 2 types of beings in this world, one and the other, I don't think that that's actually intended by Krishna to be an actual statement about the fundamental nature of reality. Because I find such a statement to be preposterous and unworkable. And the entire Gita is about giving up bad qualities and moving towards good qualities, which indicate that people are in between somewhere, and they don't just fit into 2 buckets. You don't become a devotee, and all of a sudden you flip a switch, you press a button. It's a very cheap way to think about spirituality. It's like somebody stops using drugs, and they're like, I'm never going to use drugs again. I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to do that again. And then, it ignores the reality of life, which is that it takes some work. So I don't, sometimes I will argue with Krishna and, take a non-literal reading of a verse, and that's what I'm doing here. So what to speak of, arguing with Prabhupada over his choice of divine demoniac, I got issues with Krishna on this one. And so my resolution's pretty simple. I don't think Krishna intended for us to think about the world in a radically dualistic way. It's certainly at odds with the monism, the devotional monism of the Gita, and the upward mobility of the soul in the Gita, and the idea that, that transcendental knowledge can purify even, papa krit dhamma. There's the word dhamma again. The greatest committer of sin can be liberated. No one is left out in the cold in the Gita. Everyone is always capable of redemption. Even a suduracharya, really badly behaved person, or a papa krit dhamma, the greatest of all sinful people. Everybody has a shot. So there's just fundamentally 2 types of beings. If you really take that in an absolute way, that's it. That's all you got. So I think what Krishna is really trying to do is give us a lighter, a pole of lightness and a pole of darkness, so we can move away from the darkness and towards the light from wherever we might be on the continuum. Also, the reality is usually if you look at all these qualities, you're usually better at some of them than you are at other ones. And so some of them you're gonna get a B in, and some of them you're gonna get a D in, and hopefully we're not getting Fs in any of the bad ones, and we might not have any A's yet, but we're maybe we got some B pluses. And so the reality is, if you look at these qualities individually, we're going to be in a different place on each one of them. So I don't think it's wrong to look at the Gita in a way that seeks to make it practicable and realistic. Tired, brother? It's all right. You want to stand up? You can take a nap. It's totally up to you. Do your thing. Your birthday boy. Do whatever you want to do. In general, I'm just happy you're here. I never give you too much heat for sleeping. Yeah. So that's my That's my rant on that. Also, within this very chapter itself, Krishna tells you to turn away from the darkness and turn towards the light, and gives you some hope. And so, therefore, even if there are these two types of people, there's malleability and there's permeability, and you can move from one to the other. If you can move from one to the other, then I'm sure it's not just a simple like flip of the switch. Krishna doesn't indicate you just have to press a button. It's like I said, it's a really cheap way of looking at anything. And so, just by the very fact that Krishna's encouraging you to give up the naraka dvar, the doors to hell, of lust, anger, and greed, that indicates a process and a continuum and some effort. Does this make sense? Anyway, that's my yeah, what do you got?
I have a question about
Well, let's wait till we get there.
Okay.
Let's wait till we get there. We're going to have to deal with it. Because unfortunately, Krishna just actually brings this stuff up. All right. Those who are asuras do not know what is to be done and what is not to be done. Neither cleanliness nor proper behavior nor truth is found in them. Well, have you ever been in a situation where you don't know what is to be done and what's not to be done? Sure. Does that mean that neither cleanliness nor proper behavior nor truth was found in you? Have you ever sincerely wanted to know the truth but just not known because of your ignorance or your materialism or whatever, and had a rough time, but you actually want to do the right thing? And you can see where these double, triple, quadruple barrel statements that have some value, but they're designed to be polarizing, like a Myers-Briggs personality index, like different ways you survey people to get to stuff. They say the world is unreal, with no foundation, no God. They literally say the world is anishwar, no God. They say it's produced by sex desire and has no cause other than lust. Of course, that's redundant. So they say that the world is born of union. And what else of a cause but lust? So it's born of union, meaning sexual union. So interestingly, what does Krishna appear to be describing here? Is he describing a demon? No, demons are talking about Lucifer and Beelzebub and you know what I mean? Right? That's what demons are on about. But here, we appear to be getting just kind of a standard atheist materialist. Who believes that desire is all that really matters. Kind of a hedonic, maximizing pleasure, ends justifies the means, atheistic, philosopher-type personality. Doesn't believe in any absolute truth, which of course is an absolute statement. You absolutely, positively do not believe in any absolutes. You just committed yourself to one, namely that there are no absolutes. That the world has no foundation, chaos theory. You got kind of a garden variety, materialism, atheism, positive utilitarianism, hedonic, results-based philosophy, no fundamental duties, no absolutes, definitely not a deontological point of view. Definitely not a deontological point of view where there's a fundamental right and wrong. And so it sounds, like a typical materialist, which is why, again, materialist is a good, one good word to use in our definition. Degrading, materialistic, atheistic, they're all good words. I think it's surprising that Krishna's describing, many modern philosophers. I think that's kind of cool. Carlos made a point. Yeah, actually it's nice. Carlos made a really nice point here. The last chapter talks about fallible and infallible beings, fallen and unfallen beings. And in this chapter, that's described in some ways in more detail. And in the same way, you can move from one to the other, and God's always distinct. So this chapter also discusses that in more detail. Nice point, Carlos. Never thought of that. It's a nice point. Following such conclusions, this, chaos theory, atheism, materialism, right? The demoniac, who are lost to themselves and who have no intelligence, actually says they have little intelligence. Alpa Buddhaya means little intelligence. Nashta Atmana means lost to themselves, lost souls. They engage in unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. That's a pretty literal translation. I'm sorry? Yeah, that sounds pretty bad. Of course, I don't know. I mean, if you are burning down rainforests to make land for grazing cattle, that's like, that definitely, I feel violent thoughts towards such people. Less for destroying Mother Nature in form of rainforest, more for, the raising cattle. But I wouldn't necessarily describe somebody burning down rainforests and driving native indigenous people out of the rainforests and, offering them opportunities as sex workers in order to clear-cut forests in Brazil for raising cattle that then, destroys leads to global warming and, of course, also kills people because of the eating. The global warming is going to do us in, and then we also get colon cancer from eating all the meat, and then super bad karma for cutting down the rainforests, and species of fauna and flora going extinct, and then those natives who lived in that place since the beginning of time now end up working in shanty towns, like truck stop workers, and a lot of them turn to sex work. That sounds pretty bad. I don't know that I would actually consider such people demons. Like they lack the horns I generally associate with demons. I would call them gross materialists. Certainly they're destroying the world. But this idea that their fundamental existence is evil and they are fundamentally created of sin, and that if you look in their hearts, there's nothing good in them. I don't believe that. It's not my worldview. I might even go and do kirtan with those people and, try to turn them around. You follow? I mean, shoot, I might tell them to, maybe don't do full clear cutting, do more selective cutting, and maybe, pay your sex workers better wages and, raise goats, not cows. I have a bunch of stuff I would say. I don't know if I'd say that one, at least not on camera. But, I might have all sorts of intermediary advice to recommend to them that was designed to help make their situation a little better. Even giving condoms to the workers or something like that, so the STD thing isn't so bad. I mean, I don't believe in contraception, but I would probably if you gave me a list of they're going to do 5 things for you, but none of them can totally kill their operation. I would figure out the best ways I thought they could make things a little better. Prabhupada did that. Prabhupada was going to have a meeting with Indira Gandhi. He wrote down 10 things she had to do. He wouldn't meet with her. He said she had to come meet with him. She wouldn't come to meet with him, so he sent one of his representatives. He said a sadhu shouldn't have to go to meet a state politician. Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India. And one of the things Prabhupada said was no more public meat eating. He could have gone big and said no more meat eating in the whole state of India, or in the whole country of India. But he said no more public meat eating, because he knew that the Muslims are going to eat meat somehow, and so they could just do it, not in public, and that would be enough. He tried to find some way to work with the political system that he was maybe having a voice in for a moment in the mid-70s. So following such conclusions, the demoniac who are lost in themselves and have no intelligence, they engage in unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. And so, people can destroy the world without being straight up demons, is my point. I went on way too long there to respond to what was said, but I want to kind of move forward. Taking shelter of insatiable lust and absorbed in the conceit of pride and false prestige, the demoniac, thus illusioned, are always sworn to unclean work, attracted by the impermanent. In other words, they end up doing bad stuff because they're trying to get ahead in the material world. You following this? They believe that to gratify the senses is the prime necessity of human civilization. Thus, until the end of their life, their anxiety is immeasurable. That's like a literal statement. Asha pasha shatai bodha. They're bound by the ropes of hundreds of desires. Kama, krodha, parayana. They're devoted to anger and lust. Ihante kama. Ihante kama bhog artam. They think that the purpose of life in this world is to enjoy. Anyena artha sanchayan. Hold on. I'm sorry. This is two verses together. Here it is. Chintam aparimeyam cha pralayantam upashita. They cling to unlimited desires until the end. There it is. They have unlimited desires and wants that last up until the end of their life. When I read this, I think of a coarse materialist. Theoretically, this person could believe in God, but functionally they don't believe in God. So they could believe in God in some sort of social sense, but functionally they're atheists. They're materialists. They're enjoyers. The proof of their life is that enjoyment is the most important because it compromises their morals and their integrity. And it actually even forms a new moral system where whatever makes you happy is justified. And so the more extreme forms of this, whatever makes you happy is therefore justified because there is no absolutes and there is no God. You can do whatever you want. And even if you did believe on some level in God, then functionally you're an atheist because you care most about enjoying. You guys following this? Bound by a network of hundreds of thousands of desires and absorbed in lust and anger, they secure money by illegal means for sense gratification. The demoniac person thinks, so much wealth do I have today, and I will gain more in accordance to my schemes. So much is mine now, and it will increase in the future, more and more. He is my enemy, and I have killed him, and my other enemies will also be killed. I'm the Lord of everything. I'm the enjoyer. I'm perfect, powerful, and happy. I'm the richest man. It actually sounds like positive affirmations, just a little bit more than most people are willing to go for, but not that different. Not that different. I'm perfect, powerful, and happy. I'm the richest man. I have the mostest riches. I'm the mostest happy. All other happy people are asking me about becoming happy. It does sound a bit like a Trump speech. I am the richest man surrounded by aristocratic relatives. There is none so powerful and happy as I am. I shall perform sacrifices, I shall give some charity, and thus I shall rejoice. In this way, such persons are deluded by ignorance. Krishna actually models the statements of such persons. Idam adya maya labdham. This today I have gained. Imam prapye manoratam. This desire I will achieve. Manorata means chariot of the mind. It means this desire, the thing that's running through my mind, I will achieve. Idam asi idam api me. This is mine. Bhavishyati punara. And this wealth will also be mine. So, Krishna actually models what the person sounds like. It gets a bit ridiculous. And again, Krishna speaking, it actually sounds like a Trump speech, but surprisingly. But although Trump, for all of his unattractive qualities, he bought the railroad yards in New York City and Manhattan in the 70s. It was one of his first big real estate deals, and it was a huge railroad. It's like a huge piece of land because it's the railroads around there, and we needed a place to park our Rath Yatra carts for the whole year because we built Rath Yatra carts and they stood around for the whole year and weren't used. We approached Trump and he agreed to let us keep our Rath Yatra carts at his railroad yards. And so the Rath Yatra carts for the New York temple were kept at the railroad yards by Trump's permission. The temple president from the New York temple went to Trump's office and Trump signed off on it. Shook his hand and said thank you. So, at least he did that. Whatever. He's eating McDonald's every other day and he's like, Mr. Cheeseburger. It's like a human cheeseburger. But he did do that favor for the Hare Krishna movement. And, got nothing for it. It was actually just straight charity. Surprisingly, it says, I will give some charity, I will sacrifice. That's part of it. And, that person might be formally religious. They might have some formal religiosity about them. Rather than understand these verses in this absolutist way, which again, if you follow my model, and Krishna's speaking in these absolute ways to help you come up with two polar opposites to create a heuristic that will help you troubleshoot your own life and move forward and go in a better direction. You could say, I'm doing okay. I'm making my way. I'm popular. Things are working out for me. Those people were against me, but I got over on them. I'll get over on the rest of the people. I'm climbing the ladder. I'm going to become successful. If you just modified those statements and made them a little less over the top, then a lot of people fit into that bucket. Where their fundamental thing is sweat off my own back, climb the ladder of success, don't mind stepping on a few heads to get there, I want to fulfill my desires. And we find people go to these places. Even with drugs and sex and stuff like that, people, they have some good basic integrity, but then, when integrity competes with their desires, they just throw their integrity out the window for a day or a week or a month. And so this happens. People get overwhelmed by their material desires all the time. They functionally become like this, even if not officially. I think by understanding the verses in this way, it's way healthier because a lot more people fit in the bucket, and it gives you something more to chew on, and it's a little harder to just laugh this off and slough it off and say, this doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with me. And so there is value in saying, it's like, like in boxing, it's like there's straight punches and there's curved punches. It's actually correct. But then within the curved punches, there's uppercuts and hooks. and the straight punches are jabs and crosses. Okay, that's also true. But then there's also something called overhand, which is a curving punch, but it's a little bit different than a hook or a cross, a hook or an uppercut. You know? Then there's also sometimes when you're throwing a jab, you have to get over your opponent's guard, so your jab actually has a little angle to it, and it kind of goes up and over your opponent's guard and then down to hit him in the face. So now you've got a straight punch, a jab, but the way you manifest the jab, depending on the way your opponent's guard is positioned, then you might put a little curve on that jab. And so although you might say they're straight and curving punches, just to kind of get somebody, just kind of wrapping it. Like just today I was teaching Nick and I was explaining, if your shoulders are over your hips, then I'm going to push you back. If your shoulders are in front of your hips, I'm going to pull you towards me. Then naturally the question is, like, what do I do? Well, tough luck. It's like, that's the game. You got to be somewhere in the middle. You got to get up straight, and I'm going to push you back. Then you got to lean forward, then I'm going to pull you forward. Then you got to go straight again, and that's the game. That's the game. You go back and forth. And so when these types of ideas, heuristic, rules of thumb, basic ways of looking at the world, dichotomies, are incredibly useful didactic tools. They're used all the time to help people get an orientation around something. And then it meets real life and it becomes incredibly more nuanced. But when you teach it, sometimes you just break it down really simply to make it real simple for people. Half the time as a therapist, people are like, what should I do? And you're like, you know what you should do. I'm like, yeah, okay, I do know what I should do. Like that happens like all the time. But they might not know what they should do. But maybe in certain contexts you just say that to them, and you make it real black and white like that, but then sometimes somebody's asking what should I do, and it's a lot more nuanced. And so I don't fault Krishna for making stuff super simple. It's an expert teaching tool that's used all the time by everybody, all the time. You follow? There's a reason why it's like they got stereotypes like, are you black or white on your driver's license? There's a reason for it. Because if you're running from somebody, they want to be able to describe you as black or white. It's an incredibly useful tool. The fact that it creates stereotyping is problematic, and that needs to be dealt with. But if you're talking to police officers who are chasing somebody with a gun, and you're like, it's a white guy, then the black people you have to look at. You follow? And so stereotypes, cliches are useful because they're true in a lot of circumstances. Stereotypes are useful because they're broad generalizations that account for a lot of what you experience in life. These generalizations, these stereotypes, this kind of a very right and wrong, light and dark, truth and falsity, there's value in this. You just got to dig a little and not just, dismiss it. And if you do that, there's a lot of wisdom here about the nature of materialism, the nature of atheism, the nature of the philosophies that attend to those desires and spring from those desires. What happens to people who make their life about acquiring things? They're in anxiety all the time because they're afraid of things getting taken, because you're in the material world, and if your whole thing is about what you have, you got to worry about people taking your stuff, and that's a legitimate fear, and you'll be afraid your whole life. If your happiness is who you are, nobody can take that from you. This is real stuff. Thus perplexed by various anxieties and bound by a network of illusion. Moha jala samavritaha, covered by a net of illusion. It's a really great poetic description. They become too strongly attached to sense enjoyment and fall down into hell. All right, so they fall down into hell. So what does that mean? Ugh. Well, self-complacent, always impudent, deluded by wealth and false prestige. They sometimes proudly perform sacrifices in name only without following any rules or regulations. All right? Got that? Bewildered by false ego, strength, pride, lust, and anger, the demons, the asuras, become envious of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is situated in their own bodies and the bodies of others, and blaspheme against the real religion. It doesn't actually say they blaspheme against the real religion. It says they deride the Lord who is within their own hearts and the hearts of others. Those who are envious and mischievous, who are the lowest among men. There's where it's not so bad having it be men about men. If you're a feminist, you're like, I'm okay with that. You call it men. I perpetually cast into the ocean of material existence, into various demoniac species of life. I put them into asura yonis, into the wombs of asuras. So you have an asura mentality, you take birth amongst the asuras. All right. So now hell is being born in an inauspicious situation. Do you see that? That's a little different than most people's conception of hell. You follow? The word narak does mean hell, and Krishna did use that word, narak, but here it says, kshipami, I cast them into ashubham, inauspicious. The wombs. Ajashram, constantly. Prabhupada translates this forever, which isn't wrong, but you could also just say I constantly do it. And so that sounds pretty bad. That might sound like perpetual bondage. Attaining repeated birth among such species of demoniac life, O son of Kunti, such persons can never approach me. He just says they don't approach me. Doesn't say they can never approach me. But Prabhupada's running with the feeling, you know? Prabhupada's inspired, so he's running with it. You know, he's like, Krishna's certainly on a rant here. So Prabhupada's jumping in and going with him. Does that make sense? But if you look technically, it doesn't say it's forever. Constantly would be another reasonable translation. It doesn't say they can never approach me. It says they don't approach me. Gradually they sink down to the most abominable type of existence. So it's like even just taking birth in these terrible wombs over and over again isn't enough. They go even lower. There are 3 gates leading to hell: lust, anger, and greed. Every sane man should give these up, for they lead to the degradation of the soul. The man who's escaped these 3 gates of hell performs acts conducive that are for self-realization and gradually attains the supreme destination. So it's interesting, but if you can escape the 3 gates of hell, then it's not your fundamental situation. Do you follow? If it's life after life, then there is always a chance of escaping these things and moving back upwards again. And so although Krishna is speaking in very sensationalized language, it's nothing like the radical dualism of a permanent heaven and a permanent hell that we're familiar with in the West, and therefore looking at terms like heaven and hell and demon and divine are problematic because we have certain conceptions and then we're not able to read clearly what's being said here. Did you guys follow that? He who discards scriptural injunctions, acts according to his own whims, attains neither perfection nor happiness nor supreme destination. Okay? That's a little switch. One should therefore understand what is duty and what is not duty by the regulations of scriptures. Knowing such rules and regulations, one should act so he may gradually be elevated. Well, this is interesting. This switches it up, and we'll discuss this more next week. But Krishna mentions that there is the world is apratishta. It has no foundation. Anishwar, no God. When you look at, let's say, a country like the U.S. of A., we have a constitution. Every single law in this country has to be in congruence with the Constitution. If you want to make some big changes, you got to put an amendment into the Constitution. You study constitutional law. Barack Obama studied constitutional law. Most Supreme Court justices study constitutional law. All lawyers have to take at least some constitutional law classes. They have to understand how the federal and state and local ordinances and laws follow and obey and are in congruence with the federal law. There's a Federal Animal Welfare Act of 1966 about what you can and cannot do with animals. State laws can be more strict, but they can't be less strict. If the state law is less strict, the federal law comes into effect. You guys follow this? Sometimes the Fed says it's got to be like this. Then you can make it more strict, you can nuance it, but you can't not do it at all, otherwise the Fed law comes into effect. The Constitution is our absolute source of what is right and what is wrong in this country. Without such a legal code, chaos ensues and it becomes a strongman culture, and whoever's strongest and most violent wins. As you move towards civilization, as you move towards equal rights, as you move towards decency and civilized existence, you have to move towards a body of texts, a body of rules. There wasn't a separation of church and state, therefore the scriptures were both secular as well as spiritual authority. And when Krishna's trying to establish, he doesn't say you have to believe in God, because that could be whimsical. He says you have to believe in scriptures. And that changes your nature from being an asura to asura, is that you follow a civilized standard of existence and you look to some body of wisdom higher than yourself for determining what you should and shouldn't do. And your whim doesn't become the ultimate. And that's why just divine and demoniac doesn't, because if you look at this critical distinction Krishna makes here between what constitutes an asura and asura, it's obedience to the scriptures. Interestingly, astik and nastik are two old terms from Manu, going back thousands of years, to describe the different traditions of the world. Astik it means like traditions that actually exist, and Gnostic means they don't really exist. Not this. They don't have any real existence. And they're usually translated as religious and atheistic. But that's not true, because there's Gnostic traditions that believe in God, and there's Astik traditions that are atheistic. What makes a tradition Astik, according to Manu, and this is like a very ancient law book in India. According to Manu, what makes a system Astik, or bona fide, is that it accepts scripture. What makes it Gnostic is it doesn't. Ultimately, you have to get down to, this is my arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. This is my standard. This is what we measure things against. This is how we judge things. Without such a working value system, a working system of integrity, a higher text or body of wisdom or body of teachings or set of individuals that you follow, then you're left floating in no man's land, just doing whatever you want to do. And so Krishna's statements here, they're very, very powerful statements about epistemology, about how you know something is true, how you prove something is true, how you run a society. There has to be some objective standard that people adhere to. And for us, it's the Constitution. People, I don't accept the Constitution. Yeah, tough luck. If you're born in this country, you accept the Constitution. And if you say you don't accept it, we don't care. We're going to make you accept it. It's called social contract theory. It's how every country runs. And so when you look at what Krishna's saying here, it's like hell isn't really hell. And there is always a way out. That's why he says there's a way out. And the way out is to accept some higher standard, some higher principle, some higher power, some higher body of teachings that governs your life, so you're not just running your life on a whim. And that's the critical line of demarcation between the asura and the daiva. You guys follow that? We'll get into it a little bit more, but we did enough for today. Thank you very much.